There's a lot going on as far as the war in Ukraine is concerned. President Zelensky is mad. He wants to join that pact soon. That move, though, is being put off. And let's talk to Joseph Lindsley in Ukraine about that. And Joe, I am a big fan of President Zelensky, but I really think in this case, isn't he knocking on a door that's shut tight? I mean, he's getting such great support from the West, especially from the United States. But if Ukraine becomes part of NATO now, then it escalates the war in a way that I don't think anybody wants. What do you think?
Well, Bob, good afternoon from Kharkiv, 30 miles from Russia. And I think, President Zelensky made it very clear that he understands that NATO is not going to accept Ukraine as a member until there's victory for Ukraine. And so he's made that very clear. He simply wanted a clearer invitation to join NATO. And, NATO, I mean, kind of as I expected. And when we were speaking a few days ago, I said the main question that needs to be answered by Western powers, by NATO leaders, and especially Washington, is, how do they define victory for Ukraine? And that's the most serious and pressing matter, because we mention this idea all the time. And even in the framework that NATO has, seemingly developed the past couple of days, they say, when Ukraine wins, there will be a process for Ukraine to join NATO. But we're skipping over the hardest part. What does winning mean? What does victory mean? And how can that be defined? And that they've really ignored. There has been some movement on the to get nations to support longer range weapons for Ukraine. But I was surprised, actually, that the British defense minister, who's been a huge supporter of Ukraine, Ben Wallace, and he was actually a contender to be the next Secretary General of NATO, although President Biden nixed that idea. But Ben Wallace at the UK said, whether we like it or not, people want to see a bit of gratitude from Ukraine. And so there's a surprising tension. I think if you look at the Ukrainians and the Eastern European countries who are, very close to the threat of Russia, they understand that Ukrainians are the ones who have been willing to risk their lives to take on this monster. And so we see, I think if you look at, just imagine if you're in the Kremlin looking at what's been happening the past 2 days in Lithuania. Is any of this going to make you more afraid? Is any of this going to be a deterrent? And I think the main impression, and from when I talk with people here, people are pretty upset and frustrated, but I think not surprised that, it's not a clear and strong message coming out of the NATO summit. Congressman Michael McFaul, he's a Republican chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee from Texas. He's been a critic of the Biden administration for not doing enough to support Ukraine. He's a rare Republican critic on that side. Some Republicans say the administration has done too much, but McFaul says that the support has actually been quite slow. And I think most people here, including Americans who are here helping, would agree with that. It's taken so long to get, and that's why this counteroffensive is such a struggle. It took so long for Ukraine to get the necessary materials here. And so we do see these frustrations. And I think it's helpful to look a little bit at the history of NATO summits. And in 2008 in Bucharest, NATO agreed to make Georgia and Ukraine one day, this kind of like pie in the sky idea. One day they could join NATO. And that was in April 2008. And just a few months later, on August 7th, 2008, Russia invaded the nation of Georgia. Russia had already occupied regions of Georgia since the 1990s, much like they've occupied parts of Moldova and parts of Ukraine for many years. And the capital of Georgia, a city in which I spent much time, was under threat. Tbilisi was under threat during this 5-day war. And finally, President Sarkozy of France he led the efforts to negotiate and to get a ceasefire. But if you look at those conditions of the ceasefire, I mean, Georgia is still 20% occupied by Russia, and they sort of set the stage for what we have now in Ukraine. Russia saw that they could get away with it. And so when NATO in 2008, said very vaguely, one day Ukraine and Georgia can join, it actually emboldened Russia just a few months later to attack the nation of Georgia. And so there's a great concern here. How will Russia? And it's actually been pretty. Besides the intensity at the front lines, which we can never forget about, and these frontline cities like Nikopol, it's been pretty quiet throughout much of Ukraine the past couple of days. The Russians have not, there's not been major strikes on Kyiv or here in Kharkiv. But what is Russia going to think based on this kind of weak and a little bit chaotic response coming out of the NATO summit these past 2 days?
We'll see what comes out of President Biden's meetings today with the President Zelensky and also NATO leaders. Do we know anything more about Prigozhin and where he is and what he's doing? Have you heard anything?
No, and I'm glad you asked, because it's the media quickly they see a butterfly in one direction and they all run over there and ignore all these other very important elements. But the fact is, we have not known. I mean, we were told that Prigozhin went to Belarus, but we don't even have evidence of that. The BBC did confirm that his private jet 2 weeks ago went to Belarus and returned the same day to Russia, but we don't know who was on it. And so there is concern. In fact, Poland has been strengthening its border with Belarus out of concern. You have the potentially the Wagner mercenaries are there, and so there's so many different pieces to watch, and I think all of this is good for Russia to keep people confused and unfocused. Meanwhile, I'll say there are people who understand, I think, very seriously what's at stake here. There's a reporter from the United States, from a prominent publication here in Kharkiv, and this reporter, she was supposed to go on vacation to Paris after her time in Ukraine, and she stayed here in Kharkiv. And I said, "What? Why did you stay?" And we were at a cafe called Paris in Kharkiv. I said, "You could be in the real place. Why did you stay here?" And she said, "Because here everyone has a very important story, and here they are fighting for Western civilization." And so I think everyone who comes here sees that and feels that very deeply. But these ideas are not necessarily understood by people who don't spend every day here. And I think that's a little bit of what we see at the NATO summit. And so, Ukraine was, praised and lauded for the most part. But as far as concrete specifics in a way that might intimidate Russia, I think it looks like the summit has been pretty weak.
Yeah, we'll see what comes out of the meetings today. As I said, meantime, Prigozhin probably should not go to the upper floors of any building. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, yeah, and there was a Russian naval officer who was assassinated during a jog, and I think it was in the past 30 hours or so, and it was on the anniversary of one of Russia's major attacks here on Ukraine, and so some people think perhaps Ukrainian secret services were somehow involved in that, but we don't know. But this is, and I think it's. I think if anyone in Ukraine, there's a safety on the ground here if you're far away from the front lines. But there are, as we've seen with what Russia does to attack people, whether they're in London or Prague and many other places, and also even within Russia, officers are not safe. So yeah, I think, and this is why I think we don't know where Prigozhin is, and the whole thing could be a charade. Bob, it is, this is all by design meant to be confusing. And also I mentioned, in the NATO summit, there are some people saying Ukraine has to meet certain standards, and among them, the Americans have been saying Ukraine needs to democratize. And a friend, an American veteran who spent a lot of time training people in combat medicine here in Ukraine, he said, saying Ukraine needs to democratize is like saying Ukraine needs denazification. When you see how fierce this democracy is, and Ukrainian democracy, I think it is so strong because it is the people. It's a social cohesion, how people help each other out. It's the only reason why Ukrainians withstood the first 3 weeks of the full-scale invasion. The government was a mess back then, and it was the people who stood up to it. But actually, the Ukrainian democracy is why they had that revolution in 2014, and to take control of their society from the elites. And that democracy is such a threat to powerful people. I mean, that's why Vladimir Putin is sending millions of dollars worth of missiles here every week, because these are people who cannot be controlled. And as one little anecdote of that, there's a Ukrainian sergeant major. He's got a major following on social media. He's a friend of friends of mine, and he had some problems with his commanders in the counteroffensive. And so he complained to his audience, and in Ukraine, the audience matters, the people matter. And he got a meeting with President Zelensky a few days ago, just a sergeant major, to register his complaints. And so here, the people really do rule, and that's exactly why this is happening. And I think it's hard for a lot of the elites in Brussels and Washington to fathom that, because our democracy in America is not, I think, perhaps, I think I can say confidently, it's not as vibrant as it is in Ukraine.
Wow. Joseph Lindsley in Ukraine. Thanks for the reporting and the commentary as always, Joseph.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you for introducing Ukraine on your social media pages. That's very important that much more people can get more information about the situation here and how everybody can help Ukraine to stay stronger and to save all the world.
Що він сказав?
Well, which side are you on?
На чиїй ти стороні,
Come on now. Oh, which side are you on?
на чиїй ти стороні.
Єбать.